What if everything that came before us and every voice, every dwelling, every hand that learned to shape stone, was buried not slowly but in a single breath? What if the world we walk upon is not the first, nor even the second, but only the most recent layer of something far older, far stranger, and far more uncertain than the textbooks would ever allow? Somewhere, in the long slow exhale between two epochs, a world ended, and nobody, at least nobody whose name survives, was left to write it down. So before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, into the dim quiet of the room around you, into the soft weight of the hour, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what is being made here. Only if these slow, drifting hours of forgotten history feel like something worth returning to. And if you wish, share where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Somewhere out there, another mind is awake at the same hour, listening to the same whisper. The story begins, as so many do, with ice. For nearly 100,000 years, the northern half of the planet lay beneath a sheet of frozen silence, in places more than 3 kilometers thick. The continents wore a pale armor, forests had retreated to slivers of refuge. The sea had withdrawn from its modern shores, exposing land bridges and lost coastlines where now only salt water rolls. And then, somewhere around 12,000 years ago, give or take a century, the ice began to go. Not gracefully, not in the orderly retreat one might imagine from a textbook diagram, but violently, erratically, in surges and collapses that left scars across the bedrock so vast that humans walking among them today often fail to recognize them at all. There is a strange detail that scientists have struggled to explain for more than 2 centuries. In the frozen soils of Siberia and Alaska, embedded in the permafrost like flies in amber, lie the bodies of mammoths. Not skeletons picked clean by predators, not remains weathered by time. Whole animals, hides, hair, organs, even, in some cases, the half-chewed grasses still pressed inside their mouths. They died standing or grazing, or perhaps lifting their heads against a wind they did not understand. And then, somehow, they were preserved almost instantaneously, sealed within a cold so sudden that the meat in their stomachs never had time to spoil. Modern butchery cannot replicate the speed required for such preservation. And yet there they lie, by the tens of thousands scattered across the great northern plains, as if some moment of catastrophe had reached down and frozen the world itself in mid-gesture. How does one freeze a continent in an afternoon? The textbooks shy away from the question. The standard timeline suggests gradual climate change, a warming that began around 15,000 years ago and stuttered its way upward through millennia. But the bodies in the ice tell a different story, a story of suddenness, of a switch flipped, of something that came too fast for animals to flee, too cold for any winter most of them had known, and too brief to have left more than a thin signature in the stone. Geologists have a name for the boundary that marks this disturbance, a boundary visible in cores drilled from glaciers, lake beds, and ocean floors. They call it the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, a neat phrase, a clinical phrase, the kind of phrase one uses when one wishes not to dwell too long on what it actually contains. What it contains beneath the syllables is the death of a world. The mammoths went, the mastodons went, the short-faced bears, the dire wolves, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloths the size of elephants, the American camels and horses and lions, all of them gone. In North America alone, more than 30 genera of large mammals vanished within a span so geologically thin that it cannot easily be measured. Whole ecosystems collapsed, forests were uprooted, vast inland seas drained in days, and the ice that had held the continents in its grip for nearly 100 millennia, released its waters in floods so enormous that the modern human mind, accustomed to its tidy rivers and bounded coasts, struggles even to imagine them. And yet, and here the question begins to grow teeth, humans were already there, already alive, already watching across the Americas, across Europe, across the steppes of Asia and the islands of the Pacific Rim. Anatomically modern humans had been present for tens of thousands of years before the ice retreated. They had developed languages, mythologies, tools of astonishing sophistication. They had buried their dead with ornaments. They had painted the walls of caves with images so precise, so artistically composed that 20th century painters would later confess to feeling humbled by them. And then the world they knew came apart, and what they remembered of it, and if anything, has come down to us only in fragments, in stories, in the strange recurring dreams that all the world's mythologies seem to share. The official sciences tell us that civilization, as a concept, did not yet exist. That before the ice ended, our ancestors lived only as scattered bands of foragers, their lives small, their horizons narrow, their tools rudimentary. It is a tidy narrative. It makes the sudden flowering of cities and temples in the millennia that followed seem like the natural awakening of a sleeping species. But there are cracks in this story. There are always cracks, and when one bends close to the ice, close to the sediment layers, close to the strange geometric stones rising out of Anatolian hillsides, one begins to hear something underneath the official silence. A whisper, a question, perhaps even a name, spoken once long ago by someone watching the sky split open, and then never spoken again. The whisper, if it exists, leaves its trace not in stone but in ice, deep in the Greenland sheet where the snow of countless winters has been pressed into translucent layers. Drillers have brought up cores that read like a book, each band a year, each year a faint chemistry of the sky above, and in those cores, somewhere around the threshold of 12,800 years ago, the writing changes, the page goes dark, the temperature signal collapses. Within what may have been the span of a single human lifetime, perhaps less, the climate of the northern hemisphere lurched downward by 10 degrees Celsius or more. The thaw, which had been gathering momentum for nearly 2,000 years, simply stopped. The ice, which had been retreating, returned. And for the next 1,200 years the world fell back into a strange and savage cold. This anomaly has a name, given to it by botanists who first noticed it not in ice but in pollen. Where lakes in Scandinavia had been ringed by warming forests, suddenly a small white flower reappeared, a flower that grows only on the cold edges of glaciers. Its name is Dryas octopetala, the mountain avens. And from this small alpine survivor came the term that geologists now use for the entire interruption, the Younger Dryas, a poetic name for what may have been one of the most violent climate shifts in the entire history of the species. A name that sounds almost gentle, almost botanical, almost like something one might whisper while drifting towards sleep. But the thing it describes was anything but gentle. Imagine for a moment the world as it had been just before. The Great Laurentide ice sheet, 2 miles thick, was already carving its edges into the warming sea. Glacial meltwaters were pouring down through the heart of North America, carving the proto-Mississippi into something twice as wide as today. The Mammoth steppe was beginning to bloom. Bands of hunters who had perhaps already crossed Beringia were spreading southward into a continent green with new growth. The world was opening, and then, almost without warning, it closed again. The forests died back, the rivers froze, the oceans cooled, and the people who'd begun, perhaps, to build something new, to plant the first seeds, to gather in larger groups, to imagine a future, were thrown back into a wilderness more brutal than the one their grandparents had known. What could have done this? The question has haunted climatologists for half a century. The most widely accepted answer involves a sudden disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great oceanic conveyor that carries warm water northward from the tropics. The theory suggests that a vast pulse of glacial fresh water, perhaps released when an ice-dammed lake the size of the Black Sea finally burst its banks, flooded the North Atlantic and shut the conveyor down. The northern latitudes, deprived of their warm current, plunged into a renewed ice age. It is a clean explanation. It fits the chemistry of the cause. It satisfies the demand for natural causes, and yet it does not entirely satisfy, because the cooling, when one looks closely, was simply too fast. Studies of the Greenland ice, particularly the now famous GISP-2 core, suggest that the temperature drop in some regions occurred not over centuries, not over decades, but possibly within a single year, perhaps within a season. The dust signal in the ice spikes upward at the same moment, suggesting that the atmosphere itself had darkened, choked with particulate matter on the planetary scale. And in sediments across 3 continents, an even stranger signature appears. A sudden, anomalous spike in platinum, an element rare in the Earth's crust but common in certain types of asteroid. As if something had fallen from the sky. This is where the story begins to fracture. For several decades, a quiet group of researchers, geologists, geochemists, planetary scientists, have argued that the Younger Dryas was not, or was not only, a climatic accident. They have argued that it was triggered by what they cannot prove with certainty, but the evidence they assemble is unsettling. Microscopic spherules of melted glass found in sediment layers across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all dated to the same horizon. Nanodiamonds, which form only under extreme heat and pressure. Carbon spherules and soot signatures consistent with vast continental wildfires. The fingerprints, in other words, of a catastrophe so wide-reaching that its trace has been preserved on multiple continents, and yet so complete that no obvious crater remains. The hypothesis, now sometimes called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, suggests that a fragmenting comet or a swarm of cometary debris struck the northern hemisphere at the close of the Pleistocene. Not a single bolide, but a shower of them, breaking apart in the atmosphere and detonating across the ice. Such an event would have vaporized portions of the Laurentide sheet, triggering the very freshwater pulse that shut down the ocean conveyor. It would have ignited continental fires whose smoke would have blackened the sky for years. It would have driven the megafauna into extinction. And it would have done all of this in a span of time so brief that those who survived would have remembered it not as a process, but as a moment, a flash, a wound. Mainstream geology has resisted this hypothesis with considerable force. The arguments against it are substantive. There is, after all, no obvious crater of the right size and age, and the spheral evidence has been disputed in some studies. The defenders of the impact hypothesis answer that an airburst over an ice sheet would leave no crater at all, and that the platinum and meltglass evidence has only grown more robust as more sites are sampled. The debate continues. New papers appear each year. The argument is unresolved, and in that unresolved space the question lingers like cold air in a doorway. What if the textbooks are missing something? What if a piece of the human story has been quietly written out, not from malice, but from a simple unwillingness to consider that the sky itself once turned against us? For if such an event happened, it would have happened to people. Real people with eyes lifted to the sky, with hands clutched to their children, with mouths open in the particular silence that follows when language is no longer enough. They would have seen something. They would have remembered something, and though their bones have long since dissolved into the soil, The question remains whether their memory somehow did not. Whether it persists, encoded in stories handed mouth to mouth across the generations, surviving as myth long after the event itself was forgotten, and whether the strange thin layer of carbon that lies just beneath the topsoil of so much of the world is not merely a geological boundary, but a kind of ancient page, blackened, scarred, and waiting to be read. That blackened page has a name among the geologists who first noticed it. They call it, with the bluntness of field workers who've spent too many years on their knees in trenches, the black mat. It is not a metaphor, it is a literal stratum, a thin, dark ribbon of sediment, often no more than a few centimetres thick, that has been observed at more than 50 archaeological sites across North America, and increasingly at sites in Europe, the Middle East, and South America as well. It lies precisely at the boundary between the world that was and the world that came after. Below it, the bones of mammoths. Above it, nothing. No mammoths, no mastodons, no saber-toothed cats, no Clovis spear points, as though the mat itself were a shroud drawn across the body of an entire epoch. The discovery is largely owed to the late geologist Vance Haynes, who spent decades cataloguing the strange consistency of this dark layer wherever it appeared. He noted that it always seemed to mark the same horizon, always seemed to coincide with the disappearance of the great Pleistocene fauna, and always seemed to contain a chemistry that was difficult to explain by ordinary means. The carbon levels were elevated, suggesting widespread combustion. The organic matter was unusual. And in some samples embedded within the mat itself, researchers began to find things that did not belong there. Tiny spheres of melted iron and silicate glass, formed only at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius. Microscopic carbon globules with internal structures that resembled nothing else in the surrounding sediment. And perhaps most arresting of all, hexagonal nanodiamonds, vanishingly small crystals of carbon arranged in a lattice that, on Earth, is known to form only under conditions of extreme shock pressure, the kind of pressure produced by a meteor impact or by an airburst. The implications, if the data are accepted, are staggering. They suggest that something 12,800 years ago scattered a layer of impact-related debris across continents, not in one place, not in one country, but across a swath of the planet measured in millions of square kilometres. The Comet Research Group, an interdisciplinary collective of scientists who have championed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, has published a series of papers in respected journals, Nature's Scientific Reports among them, documenting the spherals, the nanodiamonds, the platinum spike, and the soot. Each new paper has been met by a counterpaper. Each finding has been disputed, reanalyzed, defended, attacked. The argument has now spanned more than 15 years of formal scientific exchange. And while no consensus has emerged, what has emerged is something stranger. A body of evidence too persistent to dismiss, and too disruptive to embrace. What might it have looked like, this thing whose echo is the black mat? The most developed reconstructions describe not a single asteroid striking the Earth, but the disintegration of a much larger body. Perhaps a fragmenting comet from the torrid meteor stream, that ancient river of debris through which the Earth still passes twice a year. Such a body, breaking apart in the upper atmosphere, would not produce a single crater. It would produce a shower, a volley, multiple airbursts, perhaps dozens of them, detonating above the ice sheets and the steppes with the force of nuclear weapons. The ice would have flashed to vapour, the forest would have ignited in waves, smoke would have darkened the sky for months, perhaps years, and the survivors, wherever they crouched, however far from the impact zones, would have lived through a sequence of horrors no story now remembers in detail, but which many stories seem to remember in shape. The geologist Alan West, one of the central figures in the Impact Research Group, has described the mat as a death horizon, a line beneath which the bones of the old world are abundant and above which they are simply absent. Nothing creeps gradually upward through the layers. Nothing trails off into thinning frequencies. The line is sharp, the line is sudden. And whatever passed across it did so in a single geological instant. To stand at one of these excavation sites, at Murray Springs in Arizona perhaps, or at Lommel in Belgium, and to place a hand against the dark stripe in the trench wall, is to touch a moment that contained the silent ending of countless lives. Not abstract lives, not lives in the aggregate, but the actual breath of an actual creature suddenly cut short. There is a strange poetry in the fact that this evidence was overlooked for so long. Generations of archaeologists dug through the black mat without recognizing what it was. They cleared it away to reach the more interesting layers below. They noted it in passing as an oddity of soil chemistry, a curious dark band, a stratigraphic marker of no particular importance. The pattern was visible, but the meaning of the pattern was not. And one wonders sometimes how much else has been cleared away over the centuries. How many ancient signatures have been brushed aside in the rush toward the artifacts beneath? How many silent layers might yet be hiding in the trenches of our most studied sites, unread, unrecognized, waiting for someone to ask the right question? For there is a discomfort in such evidence that goes beyond mere science. To accept the impact hypothesis is to accept that human history began not with a steady ascent but with a rupture, that the species we are descended from passed through a bottleneck, a trauma, a near erasure that left only fragments behind. The orderly story of progress, the cave painters becoming farmers, becoming builders, becoming scribes, must give way to a darker and more ragged story, a story in which something was almost lost, a story in which what we now call civilization may not be the slow climb out of savagery, but the second draft of something earlier, something glimpsed only in shadows, something whose first draft burned. And here a question arises that orthodox science cannot quite contain. If the catastrophe was real, if the sky did fall, if the ice did flash, if the forest did burn, then the people who lived through it would have done what people always do in the wake of disaster. They would have tried to remember. They would have told their children. The children would have told their children. And those memories, distorted by time, half translated through migrations and centuries and dying languages, would have come down to us as something we no longer recognize as memory at all, as myth, as legend, as religion. The flood that washed away the world, the fire that fell from heaven, the serpent that swallowed the sun. Stories so common across the cultures of the earth that anthropologists have long puzzled over their persistence. Stories whose universality was once explained as coincidence, or as some innate feature of the human imagination. But what if the explanation is simpler than that? What if these stories are not invention at all? What if they are the last surviving testimony of an event that almost rendered testimony impossible? And what if, on some long Holocene afternoon, something fell from the sky, and the world remembered it ever after, in the only language that survived the burning? The language that survived the burning was not perhaps the only language that ought to have survived. There were others. There must have been others. And to understand why so few of them remain, one must turn from the sky to the sea, from fire to water, and consider what happened to the lands on which those vanished voices once spoke. For while the impact may have struck the ice in a single afternoon, the unravelling of its consequences took millennia, and among the most profound of those consequences was the slow, patient, inexorable rising of the world's oceans. When the great ice sheets began their final retreat, somewhere after the cold of the Younger Dryas at last released its grip on the northern hemisphere, The water they had held aloft for tens of thousands of years began to return to the sea, not as a trickle, not as a stream, as a flood that lasted 7,000 years and lifted the global ocean by something close to 120 meters. The figure is so vast it tends to slip past the ear without registering. 120 meters, the height of a 40-story building. Imagine such a column of water added to every coastline on Earth. Imagine then what it covered. The shoreline of the late Pleistocene world bore little resemblance to the shoreline we know today. Where Indonesia and the Philippines now scatter into thousands of islands, there was once a single great land mass, larger than India, that geologists have come to call Sundaland. It stretched from the Asian mainland southeast across what is now the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and the Gulf of Thailand. It was warm, it was tropical, it was almost certainly inhabited, and it is now almost entirely beneath the waves. To the north of Australia, another lost continent, Sahul, connected New Guinea to the mainland of Australia in a single unbroken expanse, across which the ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples walked for tens of thousands of years. To the west of Europe, between Britain and the continent, lay Doggerland, a vast and fertile plain crossed by rivers and dotted with marshes, where Mesolithic hunters pursued aurochs and red deer across what is now the floor of the North Sea. Fishermen still drag up their tools in trawler nets, sometimes by accident, sometimes alongside fragments of human bone. To the northwest, between Siberia and Alaska, the broad land bridge of Beringia, not a bridge at all, but a country in its own right 1,000 kilometers wide, supported its own ecology, its own animals, and almost certainly its own people. Today only the Diomede Islands rise above the strait that drowned it. These places were not marginal. They were not afterthoughts. They were in many cases the most habitable lands on Earth at the time, when humans were just beginning to organize themselves into something more complex than nomadic bands. Coastlines have always been the cradles of human settlement. They offer fish, shellfish, easy travel, mild climate, abundant fresh water from rivers reaching the sea. If one were to ask where, in any age, humans would be most likely to construct their first villages, their first towns, their first proto-cities, one would not point to the inland deserts or the high mountain plateaus. One would point to the coast. And in the late Pleistocene, the coast was on average 100 meters lower and many kilometers further out than it is today. What this means, in plain terms, is that the entire archaeological record of human coastal life from the last ice age lies beneath the sea. Not partially, not in fragments, almost in its entirety. Whatever villages were built, whatever harbours were dug, whatever earthen mounds and timber dwellings and shell middens accumulated along those vanished shores, they are now sealed under salt water that has covered them for 10,000 years. The dry land we walk on today is, in a sense, the high ground, the mountains and inland plains, the places where, in earlier times, no one would have chosen to build first. Our entire understanding of human prehistory rests on the leftover scraps that happen to lie above the rising waterline. The main course was eaten by the sea. This single fact, when one allows oneself to feel its weight, is enough to unsettle the entire orthodox narrative of human development. The conventional story holds that complex civilization began suddenly in the Fertile Crescent and a few other regions some 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, after a long, slow apprenticeship in agriculture. But this story is built on the evidence available, and the evidence available is the evidence that survived. What lies beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, of the Sunda Sea, of the Black Sea Basin, which itself was flooded catastrophically in a single year when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus around 5,600 BCE? The geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, the late 1990s, proposed that this Black Sea inundation was so sudden, so dramatic, that it drove out the people living on its old shoreline and scattered them across the surrounding cultures, and that the memory of it became the seed of the great flood myths of the Near East. Their theory remains contested, but the geological fact of the flooding is not. And the Black Sea is only one body of water. There are dozens. The Persian Gulf, when last dry, was a fertile river valley fed by the Tigris and the Euphrates, where what we now call Eden may have lain. The Mediterranean, during certain Ice Age intervals, partially evaporated, its basin transformed into a sequence of salt flats and inland lakes. The English Channel was a tundra. The Bering Sea was a steppe. Each of these vast modern waterscapes was, at one time or another within human memory, dry land, and not empty land, land where people walked, hunted, sang, married, buried their dead, and looked out at horizons that no longer exist. When marine archaeologists do manage to descend briefly to these submerged shelves, they often return with finds that should not, by orthodox theory, exist. Stone tools 40 metres below the surface off the coast of Florida, wooden posts from a Mesolithic settlement preserved in the cold mud beneath the Solent between Britain and the Isle of Wight, dated to nearly 8,000 years before the present, work timbers from a vanished forest off the German coast. Each discovery is treated, in the academic literature, as a curiosity, an exception, footnote. But when the footnotes accumulate, one begins to suspect that the main text is missing. What was lost beneath the rising sea? It is impossible to say with certainty, and that impossibility is itself the most haunting part of the question. Perhaps very little was lost. Perhaps those drowned coastlines held only the same scattered hunter-gatherer encampments that survived inland. Or perhaps something else was lost, something more developed, something whose absence has skewed our understanding of who we were before the ice broke. The orthodox archaeologists are not wrong to demand evidence, but evidence sometimes drowns, and the silence of 100-metre rise is not perhaps the silence of nothing having happened. It is more likely the silence of something having been buried so completely that even the question of its existence now requires courage to ask. Sometimes, however, the courage is rewarded. Sometimes the question is asked, and the answer rises not from beneath the sea, but from beneath the dry earth of a hillside in southeastern Turkey, where for centuries shepherds had grazed their flocks among the scattered limestone slabs without ever wondering what these slabs might be the tops of. The hill itself is unremarkable, a low rounded swelling on the Anatolian plain near the modern city of Sanliurfa, not far from the Syrian border. The Kurdish villagers called it Göbekli Tepe, the Hill of the Navel, a name whose meaning has not yet been satisfactorily explained. And in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, working from older surveys conducted by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University in the 1960s, came to the hill and recognized something the earlier surveyors had missed. The slabs were not field stones, they were the tops of pillars, massive T-shaped pillars, carved with extraordinary precision, standing upright in carefully arranged circles beneath the soil. And the soil itself had been deliberately placed there, by hand, to bury them. The dating, when it came, was almost impossible to believe. Charcoal from the lowest layers, organic material from the surrounding fill, all of it returned ages between 11,500 and 12,000 years before the present. The site, in other words, was older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing by some 7,000 years, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids of Giza by 7 millennia. And yet the pillars were not crude. They were not the rough markers of a primitive people fumbling towards symbolic expression. Some weighed up to 20 tons. They'd been quarried, shaped, transported across distances of several hundred meters, raised upright, and arranged in deliberate geometries. Their surfaces bore carved reliefs of foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, boars, and abstract symbols whose meanings have never been deciphered. They were the work of people who, according to every textbook in every university in the world, should not have been capable of producing them. For the orthodox account holds that monumental architecture is a product of agricultural civilization. The reasoning is straightforward and seems, on the surface, irrefutable. To build temples, one needs surplus labour. To have surplus labour, one needs a surplus food supply. To have a surplus food supply, one needs farming. And farming, the textbooks say, was not invented until about 10,000 years ago in this same region of the Fertile Crescent, and even then took centuries to develop into anything capable of supporting non-farming specialists. Yet here, at Göbekli Tepe, was a temple complex that predated agriculture by at least 1,000 years, built by people whose stone tools and hearth remains identified them unambiguously as hunter-gatherers, foragers, bands, the very kinds of people who by every model should have been incapable of organising such a project. Klaus Schmidt himself, before his sudden death in 2014, came to suspect that he'd inverted the standard story. That perhaps it was not agriculture which gave rise to religion and monumental construction, but the reverse. That the gathering of large numbers of people for ritual purposes, for the building of these sanctuaries, may have been what drove them to invent agriculture in the first place. Because feeding a temple congregation of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of pilgrims required food on a scale that hunting and gathering could not reliably provide. The grain came after the temple, not before. The fields were planted to feed the gods, and the order of human history, as taught for 2 centuries, may need to be rewritten with its first chapter removed and replaced. But there is something stranger still about Göbekli Tepe, something that has only deepened the mystery as excavation has continued. The site was not abandoned. It was not gradually overtaken by silt and forgotten. It was around 8,200 BCE, deliberately and carefully buried by the people who used it. They did not destroy the pillars. They did not topple the circles. They filled the entire complex with their own hands, using debris carried from elsewhere, until every monument was sealed beneath meters of earth. And then they walked away. Why? What does it mean to bury, with such evident reverence, a sanctuary one has built? In what sense is a thing both worth burying and worth abandoning? The archaeologists offer cautious speculation. Perhaps the people felt the site had served its purpose. Perhaps a religious upheaval rendered it unusable. Perhaps the burial was itself a final ritual, a formal closing of a sacred door. But none of the explanations entirely satisfy. There is the sense, when one stands among the unearthed circles, of having walked into a room from which the inhabitants left in a deliberate hurry, taking nothing with them, locking the door behind. And then there is Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, a single tall pillar in enclosure D carved with an arrangement of animals so unlike a random menagerie that some researchers have begun to suspect it is not a menagerie at all, but a star map. 2 engineers, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, working at the University of Edinburgh and publishing in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry in 2017, proposed that the figures on Pillar 43 correspond to constellations as they would have appeared in the sky around 10,950 BCE, within a century give or take of the very moment the Younger Dryas cooling event began. They suggested that the pillar was a memorial, a record, a warning, perhaps, of a comet impact that the people of Göbekli Tepe remembered, or had inherited the memory of from their grandparents' grandparents. Their interpretation has been challenged by other scholars. The vulture, the scorpion, the headless man at the bottom of the carving, all of these have been read in many ways, but the alignment mathematically holds. The night sky on the date their analysis returns is, in fact, the night sky depicted in the stone. What does one do with such a detail? It cannot be confirmed, it cannot be entirely refuted. It hangs in the strange middle space where so much of late Pleistocene archaeology now hangs, neither accepted nor dismissed, kept alive by a thin and stubborn possibility that something true might lie within it. If Sweatman and Sakritsis are correct, then Göbekli Tepe is not merely a temple, it is a record, a piece of stone testimony, carved by people who survived the ending of the old world, raised in commemoration of an event their descendants would forget but their stones would not. A monument to the very catastrophe whose existence orthodox science is still debating, and one wonders, walking among those buried circles, whether the people who carved the pillars knew that they were the survivors, whether they understood even dimly that the world before them had been broken and that they were rebuilding upon its ashes, whether the temple they raised was an act of memory, an act of mourning, an act of supplication, whether they buried it finally because they hoped someone in some distant age might dig it up again, and whether that someone, bending now over the unearthed stones, brushing dust from a vulture's wing, was perhaps the person they had been waiting for all along. If those buriers of Göbekli Tepe did indeed carry the memory of a broken world, they were not alone in carrying it. The strange thing about catastrophe, when it touches a species at scale, is that it does not vanish merely because the survivors lose the words to describe it. It transmutes. It descends into the stories told around fires, into the songs sung over cradles, into the rituals that no one quite remembers the reason for, but no one is willing to abandon. And across the cultures of the world, scattered over continents that had no contact with one another for millennia, one story repeats itself with a frequency too great to be explained by coincidence. A story of water, a story of a flood that came and ended a world. The flood myths of Earth's peoples are so numerous that the anthropologist Alan Dundes, in his 1988 collection on the subject, gathered together accounts from more than 100 separate cultures across every inhabited continent. The Sumerians told of Ziusudra, the wise king who built a vessel and survived a deluge sent by the gods. The Akkadians told of Atrahasis. The Babylonians told of Utnapishtim, whose story was inscribed on the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, dated to roughly 2100 BCE but drawing on oral tradition far older. The Hebrews told of Noah. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus and repopulated the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, each stone becoming a person. The Hindus told of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat. In China, the Emperor Yu the Great was said to have spent 13 years taming the great floods that had drowned the lands. The Hopi of the American Southwest spoke of a previous world destroyed by water. The Inca remembered Unu Pachacuti, the world-overturning flood. Aboriginal Australians, separated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years, preserved stories of rising seas that drowned ancestral lands. Stories which, when geologists came to test them against the actual sea level history of the Australian coast, were found to correspond in their geographical specifics to events that had occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. This last finding, published in 2015 by linguists Nicholas Reed and Patrick Nunn, was greeted with quiet astonishment in the academic world. They had taken 21 Aboriginal narratives from coastal communities around Australia, narratives which described in remarkable specificity the inundation of named places, the loss of certain hunting grounds, the transformation of mainlands into islands. They compared these narratives with the cooperation of Aboriginal elders to the bathymetric and geological record of post-glacial sea level rise around the Australian continent. And in case after case, the stories matched. The places described as drowned had been drowned. The features described as lost had been lost. And the time frames, as far as oral tradition could be calibrated, corresponded to the actual flooding events of the early Holocene. Memories, in other words, had been transmitted across roughly 400 generations, more or less intact, with a fidelity that Western academic theory had long held to be impossible. The implication is staggering. If Aboriginal Australians could preserve such memories for 10,000 years, why not other peoples? Why not, somewhere in the great repository of human myth, the memory of the very ending of the Ice Age itself? Plato, who lived nearly 2.5 millennia ago, claimed to have access to such a memory. In 2 of his late dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, he placed in the mouth of Socrates' interlocutor an account he attributed to the lawgiver Solon, who had supposedly heard it from priests in the Egyptian city of Sais. The story concerned an island civilization, advanced and powerful, situated beyond the pillars of Heracles in the great ocean to the west. The Egyptians, according to the dialogue, had told Solon that this civilization had existed 9,000 years before his own time, and that it had been destroyed in a single day and a single night by violent earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the sea. The Egyptians had also reportedly told Solon that the Greeks knew nothing of their own deep past, because periodically the earth was racked by destructions of fire and water, and only those who lived in remote inland places preserved memory across the cataclysms. The civilization Plato named in his unfinished account was Atlantis. Whether Plato invented the story as an allegory, or transcribed something he'd received from older sources, has been debated for as long as the dialogues themselves have been read. The orthodox view treats the tale as pure literary fiction, a vehicle for Plato's political philosophy, and dismisses any attempt to locate the lost city geographically as a quixotic embarrassment to serious scholarship. And yet the very dating Plato provides, 9,000 years before Solon, which would place the destruction at approximately 9,600 BCE, falls within decades of the end of the Younger Dryas, the same century, perhaps the same generation, when the flood waters of the melting ice were rising at their most spectacular rate, when the climate was at last stabilizing, when the great Megafauna had finally vanished, when something on Earth was concluding and something else was beginning. Coincidence, perhaps. The Egyptians may have used the round number 9,000 the way later cultures used the round number 1,000, but the dialogues nag at 1. Why this particular date? Why a story so specific in its timing, so detailed in its geography, so pointed in its insistence that the Greeks did not know their own past? Why does Plato have his speakers complain that the histories of the world have been repeatedly erased, that only fragments remain, and that civilization is younger than it knows itself to be? The Egyptian priests, if they existed and if Solon truly visited them, would have stood in temples whose hieroglyphs already recorded events thousands of years old. Their lineages of priestly knowledge stretched back into a darkness from which only fragments emerged. They believed, according to ancient sources, that the earth had passed through multiple ages, that the gods had ruled before the kings, and that the human past was vastly longer than the official record suggested. They're reported by Diodorus Siculus to have shown visitors lists of pharaohs that ran for tens of thousands of years before the historical dynasties, lists that modern Egyptology has set aside as mythological exaggeration. But what if some core of memory, some signal beneath the noise was real? What if the priests of Sais were preserving, however dimly, the same event preserved by the elders of Aboriginal Australia, by the storytellers of ancient Sumer, by the carvers of Pillar 43, different languages, different metaphors, different gods, but the same dark hour refracted through the lens of every culture that survived to remember it. Memory is a strange thing. It corrupts as it travels, it mythologizes, it mistakes the messenger for the message, but it does not easily invent. And when one finds the same story in 100 separate places, a flood, a fire, a sky that fell, a world that ended, a survivor who carried something forward, one is allowed, perhaps even obliged, to wonder whether what one is hearing is not 100 imaginations converging on the same fable, but 100 witnesses separated across millennia, still speaking softly about the same long-ago afternoon, and to wonder further what such a memory is being kept alive for, what it is waiting to remind us of, what event, perhaps, it is waiting for us to recognize before it comes again. The afternoon, whatever it was, did not end only in human memory. It ended, more brutally and more completely, in the bodies of the animals who shared the world with those first witnesses. For while the survivors among our species walked away with stories, the species who walked beside them often walked away not at all. The end of the Pleistocene was not merely a climatic transition. It was by any measure available to modern paleontology, one of the largest mass extinctions of large animals in the entire history of life on Earth. And it happened, by geological standards, in something close to a single moment. In the Americas, the toll was almost beyond comprehension. The mammoths went, both the woolly and the Columbian, the mastodons went. The giant ground sloths, some of them weighing 4 tons and standing taller than a giraffe when they reared up to feed, went. The glyptodonts, vast armoured mammals like Volkswagen-sized armadillos, went. The American camels, of which there had been several species, went. The American horses, who had evolved on the continent and roamed it in great herds, went so completely that when the Spanish brought European horses across the Atlantic thousands of years later, they were reintroducing a creature whose ancestors had vanished from the Americas without descendants. The dire wolves went. The American lion, larger than any lion alive today, went. The short-faced bear, perhaps the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore that has ever existed, went. The saber-toothed cat, that long-fanged ghost of 1,000 textbook illustrations, went. In total, more than 30 genera of large mammals, meaning more than 2/3 of all the megafauna of the New World, disappeared between roughly 13,000 and 10,000 years ago. The continent that had been a Serengeti of strange and magnificent creatures became, almost overnight in geological terms, the comparatively empty landscape we know today. The bison alone of all the great American grazing animals made it through. The pattern was not confined to the Americas. In Australia, where the megafauna had included marsupial lions, 10-foot kangaroos, and the rhinoceros-sized diprotodon, the great extinctions had begun somewhat earlier and continued through this period. In Eurasia, the woolly rhinoceros vanished. The cave bear, the cave lion, the Irish elk with its impossible 7-foot antler span, the woolly mammoth itself in its final island refuges. Even in Africa, which retained more of its megafauna than any other continent, certain species were lost. And on every continent except Antarctica, the same pattern repeated itself with eerie consistency. The largest animals went first and went hardest. Smaller mammals were affected far less. Reptiles and birds, with some exceptions, mostly survived, but anything weighing more than about 100 kilograms, anything that walked the earth as the lord of its ecological niche, anything that had no natural predator capable of bringing it down, found itself dying out in numbers that had no precedent in the previous several million years of mammalian history. The cause of this extinction has been argued for 200 years and is still not settled. 3 principal hypotheses have dominated the debate, each with its champions and its evidence and its weaknesses. The first is climate change. The shifting from glacial to interglacial conditions, with all its associated transformations of vegetation and water and habitat, would certainly have placed enormous stress on species adapted to Ice Age ecosystems. The Mammoth steppe, that vast cold grassland which had stretched from Spain to Alaska, broke apart into the less productive tundra and boreal forests we see today, and the great grazing animals who had thrived upon it found their forage diminished. The second hypothesis is overhunting, the so-called Pleistocene overkill model proposed by the paleontologist Paul Martin in the 1960s. This model holds that human hunters, expanding into pristine territories where animals had no evolutionary experience of being hunted by tool-using bipeds, simply slaughtered the megafauna to extinction. The arrival of humans in the Americas, the model notes, coincides almost precisely with the disappearance of the American megafauna, and similar correlations exist for Australia and other regions. The third hypothesis, of course, is the one we have already touched upon. The impact hypothesis, which proposes that a cosmic event, an airburst or showers of cometary debris, rendered vast tracts of habitat uninhabitable and triggered the cascading collapse. Each of these hypotheses, in isolation, fails to explain the entirety of the evidence. Climate change alone is hard-pressed to account for why the megafauna had survived many previous glacial cycles with their attendant climate transitions only to vanish during this one. Overhunting alone struggles to explain how relatively small bands of hunters with stone-tipped spears could have driven entire continental populations of fast, large, and dangerous animals to extinction within a few centuries, and struggles further to account for the disappearance of species that humans rarely if ever hunted, like the dire wolf or the saber-toothed cat. The impact hypothesis, while explaining the suddenness of the event, leaves open many questions about the precise mechanisms by which an airburst over the ice sheets could have produced extinctions across continents that were nowhere near the impact zone. And so the modern consensus, insofar as one exists, tends to admit that the catastrophe was probably synergistic. Climate, humans, and quite possibly something else all converged upon a planet whose largest creatures could not survive the convergence. What is not in doubt is the silence that followed. To stand today on the prairies of North America, in the mountains of South America, on the steppes of Eurasia, is to stand in a landscape that is profoundly emptier than it was when our ancestors first arrived there. The ecological niches once filled by giant grazers and giant predators have, in most cases, never been refilled. The forests are quieter, the plains are less crowded. The very soil chemistry of certain regions has shifted because the dung and decomposition of those vast lost herds is no longer there to enrich it. The world that humans inherited at the close of the Ice Age was a world already diminished, already stripped of its largest inhabitants, already wearing a kind of mourning we no longer know how to perceive. We mistake this diminished world for the natural one. We forget that it is not, and one wonders sometimes what the first farmers thought. What did the people of Göbekli Tepe think, looking out across landscapes that their grandparents had described as teeming with creatures the size of houses? Did they understand that the world had been larger before? Did they have words for what had been lost? Or had the silence already become so total that the absence was no longer perceived as absence at all, only as the way things were? The carvings on these buried pillars include vultures, foxes, scorpions, snakes, but also strange composite creatures, beasts that do not match any known species. Are these mythological inventions, or are they fading memories of animals already passing from the world by the time the pillars were raised? The carvers themselves are gone. They left no key. They left only the stones and the silence and the long faint suspicion that something enormous had walked beside them once, and that they had watched it go. Among the things that watched the megafauna go, and that may themselves have been watching their own ending approach, were a particular people whose name has been given to them by the modern archaeologists who first found their tools. The people themselves, of course, called themselves something else. Whatever they called themselves has been lost. What remains of them is a stone, a long, leaf-shaped fluted spear point of unmistakable craftsmanship, exquisitely flaked, channeled down its centre to fit into a wooden haft designed with the lethal grace of a tool that has been refined across many generations. The first of these points was discovered in 1929 near the small town of Clovis in eastern New Mexico, lying among the bones of a mammoth, and so the people who made it have been called, ever since, the Clovis. For most of the 20th century, the Clovis were believed to be the first humans in the Americas. Their tools, dated by carbon-14 methods to roughly 13,000 years before the present, appeared with such suddenness in the archaeological record and were spread so widely across both North and Central America in such a brief span of time that the model came to be called Clovis first. The story it told was elegant in its simplicity. A small group of hunters had crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia toward the end of the last ice age. They had found the Americas empty of human inhabitants. They had walked southward through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. They'd spread across 2 continents in perhaps as little as 1,000 years, hunting the great Pleistocene mammals as they went, leaving their distinctive spear points behind them like a signature. They were the founders. They were the ancestors. And then, around 12,800 years ago, at the precise threshold of the Younger Dryas, they appear to have vanished. The vanishing is what is so unsettling. The Clovis tradition, which had spread from coast to coast, simply stops. The fluted points cease to be made. The hearth sites cease to be occupied. The technology, so distinctive and so widespread, is replaced over the following centuries by a patchwork of regional variations, none of which match the elegant uniformity of the Clovis style. Whatever the Clovis people had been doing, however they had been organising themselves, communicating across vast distances, transmitting their tool-making techniques from band to band, collapsed. And the timing of that collapse, by an apparent coincidence that has grown harder to dismiss, falls precisely upon the same horizon as the black mat. Above the dark layer, no Clovis points. Below it, Clovis points in abundance. The first great American culture ended, by the testimony of the soil itself, at the same moment as the mammoths. This temporal coincidence has become one of the central pieces of evidence cited by proponents of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They argue that the disappearance of the Clovis is not an artifact of changing fashions in stone tools, but the genuine extinction of a population, decimated by the same catastrophe that killed the megafauna they'd hunted. The orthodox response is more cautious, suggesting that the Clovis simply diversified into new regional traditions as they adapted to new conditions, and that no actual demographic collapse need be invoked. But the genetic evidence, when it began to accumulate from ancient DNA studies in the early 21st century, told a more complicated story. Modern Native American populations, while clearly descended from very early arrivals to the continent, do not show a clean genealogical thread back to a single Clovis founding population. There are signals of multiple migrations, of bottlenecks, of mysterious admixtures with populations whose origins are still not understood. The peopling of the Americas, it now seems, was not a single event but a sequence of events. And some of those events involved almost certainly the loss of entire populations whose contribution to modern genetic stock is small or absent. But the Clovis themselves are not even the deepest mystery, for in the decades since the Clovis first model was first proposed, evidence has steadily accumulated of human presence in the Americas earlier. sometimes much earlier, than the 13,000-year mark. At Monteverde in southern Chile, a remarkable site preserved beneath a peat bog, archaeologists have documented human habitation dated to 14,500 years before the present, more than 1,000 years before any human was supposed to have reached even the northern parts of the continent, let alone the southern tip. At the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho, stone tools have been dated to around 16,000 years before the present. At Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, the dates may be older still. And at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, in 2021, researchers announced the discovery of fossilized human footprints in lakebed sediments dated to between 21 and 23,000 years before the present, meaning humans were walking through North America during the very height of the last glacial maximum, when the ice-free corridor was firmly closed, when the supposed pathway from Siberia did not exist. If those footprints are correctly dated, and the dating has been challenged, defended, and challenged again in a still ongoing scientific exchange, then the entire orthodox model of American prehistory must be revised. People were here, long before they were supposed to have been here, by routes we cannot reconstruct, from origins we have not yet identified. There is a separate hypothesis, sometimes called the Solutrean hypothesis, which proposes that some early Americans crossed not from Asia but from Europe, travelling along the edges of the North Atlantic ice sheets in small boats, following the seal hunting that the ice edge provided. This hypothesis has been heavily criticised, and most geneticists currently reject it on the grounds that no clear European DNA signature appears in ancient Native American remains. But the criticism does not entirely close the case. The genetic evidence is incomplete. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary, and the ocean is wide. What seems increasingly clear is that the simple story, the story of a single founding population walking across a single bridge into an empty continent, was always too simple. The Americas were entered perhaps several times by several routes, by peoples whose languages and technologies and traditions may have been quite different from one another. Some of them survived, some of them did not, and whatever they had built, whatever villages they had occupied, whatever knowledge they had carried with them, was subjected to the same continent-wide catastrophe that ended the Pleistocene. The fluted points of the Clovis are merely the most visible signature of a much larger world of vanished peoples, most of whom we will never know by name. The footprints at White Sands belong to no recovered body. They are simply impressions in old mud of feet that walked 10,000 years before the Clovis ever flaked their first spear, across a landscape that contained giants and mysteries and, presumably, other human travellers whose paths crossed and uncrossed across an unrecorded continent. And what those wanderers saw, what they remembered, what they carried in the strange dark hours after the comet or the cold or the rising water came for them, none of it has come down to us in any words we can read, only in stones, only in soil, only in the long, accumulating silence of a continent that turned out to have been peopled far longer and far stranger than the textbooks ever allowed. That accumulating silence is loudest, perhaps, beneath the water. For if the textbooks have been forced reluctantly and one footprint at a time to extend the human presence on dry land further back into deep time, the same pressure has begun to push outward from the modern coastlines into the shallow seas where ancient shores now lie drowned. And here, on the continental shelves of the world's oceans, divers have begun to find things that orthodox archaeology has, for the most part, declined to formally investigate, and which therefore exist in a kind of evidentiary twilight, neither catalogued nor dismissed, neither accepted nor refuted, simply lying there beneath the salt water, waiting for an academic discipline that does not yet quite exist to take an interest in them. Off the southern coast of the small Japanese island of Yonaguni in the western Pacific lies one of the most contested of these sites. In 1986, a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake, searching for hammerhead shark grounds, descended through 25 meters of clear water and came upon a structure he could not, at first, classify. A massive sandstone formation rose from the seafloor in tiers, with what appeared to be steps, terraces, right-angled walls, and rectangular niches, all carved or assembled from the bedrock. Subsequent surveys, undertaken most prominently by the marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, identified what Kimura interpreted as the remains of an entire submerged complex. Possibly a city, possibly a ceremonial centre, with what he called streets, gates, and even a stylized human face carved into one face of the rock. The structure, if artificial, would have stood above water sometime before the end of the last ice age, perhaps as much as 10 or 12,000 years ago, when the surrounding seas were 100 meters lower than they are now. The orthodox response was swift and dismissive. The geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, himself no stranger to controversial reinterpretations of ancient sites, examined the Yonaguni formations and concluded that they were natural, the product of geological processes acting upon a particular kind of sandstone that fractures along straight lines, producing surfaces that can resemble masonry without ever having been touched by human hands. Most professional archaeologists have followed this assessment. The right angles, they say, are the natural angles of bedded sedimentary rock. The terraces are erosion features. The face is pareidolia. The site is a curiosity of geology, not a relic of a vanished civilization. And there the question has more or less rested for nearly 4 decades, with Kimura and a small group of researchers continuing to investigate, and the larger discipline continuing to look the other way. But Yonaguni is not alone. Off the coast of the Indian state of Gujarat, in the Gulf of Khambat, sonar surveys conducted in the year 2001 by India's National Institute of Ocean Technology revealed what appeared to be the foundations of a vast submerged city, with grid-like patterns covering an area of nearly 9 kilometres, lying at depths of around 30 to 40 metres. Wooden artefacts dredged up from the site were carbon dated, in some cases, to between 7,500 and 9,500 years before the present. The findings made international headlines briefly, then faded from view as the academic establishment raised methodological objections and called for further investigation that has, to this date, never been adequately funded or carried out. The site simply waits. Off Dwarka, also in Gujarat, the partial submerged remains of what are believed to be the foundations of an ancient city, possibly the legendary Dwarka of the Mahabharata epic, have been investigated by India's Marine Archaeology Centre. The dating is contested, the interpretation is contested, but stones lie under the water arranged in ways that do not appear easily explicable by tide or current. Off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, a long underwater formation of large flat stones, lying in shallow water and resembling, to many observers, a constructed roadway or harbour wall, has provoked argument since its discovery in 1968. Most geologists classify it as a natural beach rock formation. Others argue that the regular spacing, the apparent jointing, the alignment of the blocks all suggest at least the possibility of human modification. The Bimini Road has been embraced by amateur enthusiasts and rejected by professionals, and as a result has been subjected to relatively little of the careful, neutral investigation it might deserve. Off the coast of Cuba, in 2001, sonar imaging by a Canadian research vessel revealed what its operators interpreted as the outlines of geometric structures, pyramids, possibly streets, at a depth of more than 600 meters. If the imaging is accurate and if the structures are artificial, they would have to predate the deepest end of Ice Age sea level rise, placing them in a wholly impossible period for any known civilization. The site has never been thoroughly resurveyed. The funding never quite materialized. The interest faded. What is one to make of this pattern? It is not certainly that any one of these sites constitutes proof of a lost antediluvian civilization. Each one, examined in isolation, can be plausibly interpreted in mundane ways. Each one suffers from inadequate documentation, from amateur enthusiasm that has muddied the scholarly waters, from the genuine difficulty of distinguishing natural geometry from artificial geometry on the seafloor. And yet the pattern itself, when one steps back and looks at it as a whole, has a quality that is hard to ignore. Around the world, on multiple continents, in the precise depth ranges where the ancient shorelines once lay, divers and survey vessels keep finding things that look, at minimum, suggestive. And the academic discipline whose responsibility it would be to investigate them treats these findings, almost without exception, as embarrassments to be quickly explained away rather than as questions to be patiently pursued. There is a particular kind of intellectual gravity that pulls professional archaeology away from the submerged shelves. To investigate them seriously would be enormously expensive. It would require ship time, deep water equipment, dive teams, and years of careful work in conditions that are unforgiving. It would risk producing inconclusive results, or worse, results that disturbed established narratives with all the professional cost that such disturbance would imply. The career incentives point inland toward the well-known sites where reputations can be made on solid ground. And so, the continental shelves remain largely unsurveyed, their depths uncatalogued, their secrets, if they have secrets, undisturbed. The orthodoxy is not maintained in this case by any explicit conspiracy. It is maintained by simple inertia, by the natural reluctance of any discipline to look in places that are difficult to look, especially when what one might find there could call into question much that has been built upon firmer seeming ground. And so the question persists in that strange unresolved space between proven and disproven. What lies down there in the dark on the drowned shores of the world that ended? Are these formations all natural, every one of them the products of unrelated geological accidents that merely resemble human artifice? Or is one of them, somewhere, perhaps just one, actually what it appears to be? A wall, a street, a foundation stone, the last visible remnant of a place where people once lived, before the ice gave up its waters and the sea came in, and the world above became the only world remembered. The ocean keeps its silence. It has had a long time to learn it, but silence, as anyone who listens long enough will eventually realize, is not always the same thing as nothing being there. Whatever lies beneath that long ocean silence, something on dry land was happening at very nearly the same time, and happening in a way that orthodox science has never been able to fully explain. For in the few millennia following the end of the Younger Dryas, that is, in the centuries between roughly 10,000 and 8,000 years before the present, humans across multiple, widely separated regions of the earth began to do something they had not done before. They began to plant. They began to harvest. They began to keep animals in pens, to select the seeds of certain plants over others, to organize their lives around fixed places rather than the wandering routes of the hunt. The shift is so profound and so apparently sudden that anthropologists have given it a name that conveys both its magnitude and the difficulty of understanding it. They call it the Neolithic Revolution. And the puzzle of why it happened, why then, why in so many places at once, why at all, remains one of the great open questions of human prehistory. The places of its emergence are scattered across the map in a way that defies easy explanation. In the Fertile Crescent, that great arc stretching from the Levant through Anatolia and down into Mesopotamia, the wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils and chickpeas began to be cultivated by people we now call the Natufians and their immediate successors. In the valleys of the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers in China, rice and millet were domesticated independently by populations that had no contact with the farmers of the Near East. In the highlands of New Guinea, taro and yams and bananas were brought under cultivation. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa. In Mesoamerica, the slow and difficult domestication of teosinte into the great staple of maize began. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yams. The list goes on. And what is most striking about it is not that any single domestication event occurred. Humans had certainly been experimenting with their food sources for many tens of thousands of years before this, but that all of these distinct independent transformations took place within roughly the same window of a few thousand years, in the immediate aftermath of the great climatic upheaval at the end of the Ice Age. The orthodox explanation rests largely on climate. The argument is that the Pleistocene, with its erratic conditions and its frequent severe disruptions, was simply too unstable to support agriculture. The Holocene, by contrast, brought several thousand years of remarkably steady climate, warm, predictable, with reliable growing seasons. Once the storm of the Ice Age had passed in this account, humans found themselves in a new world that finally permitted what had always been theoretically possible. Farming, in this view, was not so much a new idea as the realization of an old idea that had been waiting for the right weather. The argument is plausible. It is also, when examined carefully, not entirely sufficient. For one thing, the Holocene climate was not, in fact, perfectly stable in its early millennia, and farming arose in some regions during periods of considerable variability. For another, the speed and parallelism of the agricultural transitions in regions that had no contact with one another remains harder to explain than a simple climatic permission would suggest. And for a third, there is the troubling matter, already touched upon at Göbekli Tepe, that some of the earliest evidence of agriculture appears to follow rather than precede the construction of monumental religious sites, suggesting a more complicated chain of cause and effect than the textbooks have offered. Some researchers have proposed darker, more provocative explanations. The geologist Jacques Cinq-Mars and others have suggested that the abruptness of the agricultural transition implies not the gradual development of new techniques, but the sudden application of techniques that had been developed elsewhere and were imported, perhaps by survivors carrying knowledge from a vanished cultural centre. The archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, working on Neolithic Europe, identified what she believed to be a sophisticated pre-agricultural symbolic system underlying the entire region, hinting at a coherence of cultural background that was difficult to account for through purely local development. Others have pointed to the strange uniformity of certain agricultural practices across regions that should have invented them quite independently. The same patterns of crop rotation, the same techniques of irrigation, the same religious associations of grain and the dying and rising god, and have wondered whether the parallels are entirely accidental. The most provocative version of this idea, defended in various forms by writers from outside the academic mainstream, is the so-called inheritance hypothesis. It holds that the seemingly miraculous emergence of agriculture and civilization in the early Holocene was not a fresh invention by post-glacial hunter-gatherers, but a re-emergence, a slow rebuilding upon foundations laid by an earlier civilization, lost in the catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. According to this view, the survivors of that older civilization, scattered to high refuges and remote corners as their coastal heartlands were drowned and their fields were buried in ash and ice, gradually carried what fragments of knowledge they could remember to the surrounding hunter-gatherer populations, who slowly absorbed and reconstructed those fragments into the agricultural and architectural traditions of the Neolithic. The proposal is, by the standards of orthodox archaeology, unsupported. There is no direct evidence of any such mother civilization. There are only the puzzling parallelisms, the strange suddenness, the uncanny sense that something appeared too well formed to have been entirely new. And yet, when one walks through the early Neolithic sites with this question in mind, certain details do begin to nag. At Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, a settlement of perhaps 8,000 inhabitants flourished from roughly 7,100 BCE, with an architectural plan so coherent, houses packed tightly together, entered through their roofs, decorated with elaborate murals and bull skulls embedded in the walls, that the entire community appears to have arrived at this particular form already in possession of it, with little evidence of the experimental phases that one would expect to precede such a sophisticated layout. At Jericho, the oldest known city wall in the world, a stone tower of considerable engineering precision dates to around 8,000 BCE, at the very dawn of the Neolithic, when the technique of building with worked stone should still have been in its infancy. At Mergah in modern Pakistan, dental drilling, the deliberate boring of holes in living human teeth, presumably for therapeutic purposes, was being practiced with surprising precision around 7,000 BCE, a procedure that suggests not a primitive proto-medicine but a developed craft tradition whose origins are nowhere visible. These details, taken individually, can each be explained by the ordinary mechanisms of cultural development. Sufficient time, sufficient experimentation, sufficient transmission between communities. The orthodoxy is not unreasonable in its insistence that human beings are inventive, that local genius can produce remarkable results, that the rise of complexity does not require any external impetus, and yet, taken together, the details produce a faint and persistent disquiet. The early Neolithic does not feel, when one looks closely at it, like the awkward first chapter of a new civilization. It feels like the polished early pages of a book whose introduction has been torn out. And one wonders, sometimes, what the missing pages might have said, and whether the seeds those first farmers planted in the dark earth of the Holocene were truly their own invention, or whether they were carrying, without knowing they carried it, the residue of something older, something passed hand to hand across the long unrecorded centuries between the burning of one world and the patient sowing of the next. The residue of that something older, if it exists, is not always carried in seeds or in stones. Sometimes it is carried in patterns of thought, in the strange recurring shapes that human cultures use to describe the cosmos, in the way myths from different continents point with unexpected precision to phenomena that ought to have been beyond the comprehension of any pre-scientific people. And nowhere is this peculiarity more pronounced than in the matter of the stars. For when the modern researchers Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von der Schend published their book Hamlet's Mill in 1969, they made an argument so unsettling that the academic establishment has never quite known what to do with it. They argued that beneath the strange and seemingly arbitrary mythologies of cultures scattered across the globe, Norse, Greek, Egyptian, Hindu, Polynesian, Native American, lay a common technical vocabulary, a vocabulary that referred, in a coded language of gods and giants and turning mills and broken bridges, to a single astronomical phenomenon. That phenomenon was the precession of the equinoxes. Precession is one of those small celestial details that almost no one outside of professional astronomy is taught to notice, and yet which, once it is noticed, transforms one's understanding of the night sky. The Earth's axis, as it turns, does not point in a fixed direction. It wobbles slowly, like a spinning top whose handle traces a wide circle in the air. The complete circle takes approximately 25,772 years. The consequence is that the position of the sunrise on the spring equinox, measured against the background stars, drifts backward through the constellations of the zodiac at a rate of roughly 1 degree every 72 years. Over the course of a human lifetime, the shift is barely perceptible. Over the course of 2,000 years, an entire constellation slides into a new position. We are now, by ancient reckoning, in the late stages of the age of Pisces. With the age of Aquarius approaching, 2,000 years ago, the equinox sun rose in Aries, 2,000 years before that in Taurus, and so on, backward, through the long, slow procession of the heavens. To detect this drift, to measure it, to track it across the centuries, requires not merely the casual observation of one or two astronomers, but the patient transmission of precise stellar records across many generations. The Hipparchus of Greek tradition is generally credited with the formal discovery of precession in the 2nd century BCE, but the calculations he performed depended upon comparison with much older Babylonian and Egyptian observations. The Babylonians, in turn, drew upon traditions whose origins are unclear, and there are details in the mythologies of cultures far older than the Babylonians and far removed from them that seem to encode an awareness of precession's rate and meaning. The slow turning of the great mill in Norse and Finnish lore, the breaking of which causes the world's destruction. The shifting of the Dharmic ages in Hindu cosmology, each ushered in by a transition between the great cosmic eras. The succession of suns in Mesoamerican mythology, each previous sun destroyed by some cataclysm before the next is born. Read individually these myths or stories. Read together with the technical vocabulary of de Santillana and von Deschend in mind. They begin to read like fragments of a single very ancient astronomical treatise, broken apart and translated, garbled, mythologized, but still pointing to the same long, slow turning of the heavens. Whether one accepts the full thesis of Hamlet's Mill or not, certain details about the alignment of ancient monuments with celestial events are difficult to dismiss. The Great Pyramid of Giza, by the orthodox dating, was constructed around 2560 BCE. Its descending passage, when one stands at its mouth and looks upward along its axis, points with remarkable precision to the position in the northern sky where, at a particular date, a particular star would have been visible as a kind of cosmic anchor. The dating depends on which star one chooses, but the alignments are striking. The 3 pyramids of the Giza Plateau themselves, when viewed from above, lie in a configuration that the engineer Robert Bauval famously argued mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt. But Orion's belt as it appeared in the sky, not in 2500 BCE, but rather, due to precession, around 10,500 BCE, deep in the period we have been discussing. Bauval's hypothesis has been heavily disputed and is rejected by mainstream Egyptology. The match, however, is mathematically real, and the question of whether it is meaningful or merely coincidental has not been definitively settled. This brings us, perhaps inevitably, to the Sphinx, that great enigmatic figure carved from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, sitting in eternal patience at the foot of the pyramids, the largest and oldest monolithic statue in the world. Orthodox Egyptology dates the Sphinx to the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BCE, on the basis of stylistic comparisons and the proximity of the figure to Khafre's pyramid. But in the early 1990s, the geologist Robert Schoch, the same scholar who would later examine the Yonaguni formations, undertook a careful examination of the weathering patterns on the body of the Sphinx and the walls of the enclosure surrounding it. His conclusion was that the patterns visible there, deeply furrowed and rounded in profile, were not consistent with wind erosion or with chemical weathering by groundwater. They were consistent, rather, with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall, and heavy rainfall in the climatic history of the Egyptian desert has not been a regular feature for many thousands of years. The last sustained period during which Egypt could have experienced the kind of rainfall necessary to produce such weathering, according to paleoclimatic studies, was the early Holocene, meaning sometime before about 7000 BCE, and quite possibly considerably earlier than that. Schoch's argument, supported by the independent author John Anthony West, was that the Sphinx must therefore be far older than orthodox Egyptology allows, not by hundreds of years but by thousands, possibly by 5,000 years, possibly by more. Egyptologists pushed back vigorously, arguing that the weathering could be accounted for by other mechanisms, that comparable patterns appear on undisputed Old Kingdom tombs, that the geological reading was flawed. The argument has continued for more than 30 years and remains unresolved, with most professional Egyptologists rejecting Schoch's conclusion and a small but persistent minority of geologists and independent researchers continuing to defend it. What is rarely disputed, however, is that the Sphinx faces almost exactly due east, and that on the morning of the spring equinox around 10,500 BCE, an observer standing between its paws and looking out at the rising sun would have seen the dawn break over the eastern horizon directly behind the constellation of Leo. The lion, in other words, would have been gazing at his own celestial reflection in the very age when the Younger Dryas was ending and the New World was beginning. Whether this is meaningful is, again, a matter of interpretation. Whether it is coincidence is again a question without a definitive answer, but one is left, after considering such alignments, with a quiet and persistent unease. The orthodox account of human history places the first careful observations of the heavens within the historical period in Sumer and Egypt and Babylon, no earlier than perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Yet the encoded references in mythology, the processional alignments of the oldest monuments, the geological wear on the Sphinx, all seem to whisper of something earlier, of an era in which someone, somewhere, was watching the sky with a precision the textbooks do not officially permit. And one wonders, sometimes, whether the great cosmic clocks built into the rock of those ancient places were not merely ornamental, whether they were meant, perhaps, as a message set at a particular hour, addressed to anyone who might one day learn to read it. A message that the world had ended once. A message about exactly when. That message, if it was ever set in stone with such intent, has had its readers all along, and many of those readers have wished it unread. For the history of human knowledge is not, despite the comforting narratives of progress, a simple accumulation of evidence patiently sifted by impartial scholars. It is also, and sometimes primarily, a history of selection, of decisions about what to record and what to ignore, what to preserve and what to allow to perish, what to teach in the universities and what to consign to the margins, where eccentrics and amateurs are permitted to argue without disturbing the central narrative, and the question of what happened in the deep past, of whether the human story is older, stranger, more catastrophic than the textbooks acknowledge, has been, throughout the modern era, one of the most heavily curated questions in the entire intellectual landscape. The curation began long before there was any modern science of archaeology. In antiquity, the great library of Alexandria, founded under the Ptolemaic dynasty in the 3rd century BCE, and gathering at its height perhaps 500,000 scrolls from across the Mediterranean and the Near East, was the largest single repository of human knowledge that had ever existed. It contained, by the testimony of its own ancient catalogues, works on astronomy, geography, history, medicine, mathematics, and natural philosophy that have not survived in any other form. It contained the writings of Berossus, a Babylonian priest of the 3rd century BCE, who recorded traditions of his temple stretching back, by his own account, more than 400,000 years, including detailed lists of antediluvian kings whose reigns far predated any conventional historical chronology. It contained the work of Manetho, an Egyptian priest of the same period who compiled a chronology of Egyptian rulers extending similarly far into deep antiquity. It contained, in short, the unsifted memory of the ancient world. And it was destroyed. The destruction of Alexandria was not a single event, but a long process of fires and neglect and successive depredations across several centuries. By the time the last of its collections vanished, sometime in late antiquity, what had been lost was effectively unrecoverable. We know of Berossus and Manetho only through fragmentary quotations preserved by later authors, who themselves were often citing summaries of summaries. The detailed king lists of antediluvian rulers survive only as numbers and names without context, easily dismissed by modern historians as mythological exaggerations. The astronomical and geographical works that might have preserved earlier traditions of stellar observation or coastline mapping are gone. What we have of the ancient world's deep knowledge is the residue, the leftover crumbs, the fragments that happen to be preserved in the libraries of Constantinople or in the great translation movements of medieval Baghdad. Most of it burned, most of it was lost, and what we now call ancient history is, in a real sense, the small surviving remnant of a vastly larger archive that the centuries did not allow us to inherit. But the curation did not end with the loss of the ancient libraries. It continued in subtler forms into the modern era. When the science of archaeology took shape in the 19th century, it did so within a particular intellectual framework. The framework had been shaped by the religious chronologies of Europe, which had long held that the world was perhaps 6,000 years old. As geological evidence forced these chronologies to expand, the new academic disciplines accommodated themselves to a story in which civilization, properly speaking, was still relatively recent, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 years old, beginning in Egypt and Mesopotamia, spreading outward from there. This story was congenial to many of the political and ideological concerns of the era. It made history manageable. It made progress visible. It placed the European observer at the apex of a long upward arc whose earlier phases were always being slowly clarified by patient excavation. And it left no room, intellectually or institutionally, for the possibility that anything significant might lie deeper. Discoveries that did not fit this framework were treated accordingly with suspicion. When Heinrich Schliemann, the German amateur, claimed in the 1870s to have found the actual ruins of Homer's Troy at the mound of Hisarlik in Turkey, he was met initially with derision from the academic establishment, who considered the Iliad a work of pure literary fiction with no historical basis whatever. Schliemann was largely right, and in his being right he embarrassed an entire generation of professional scholars who'd been confident he was wrong. When Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola, a Spanish nobleman and amateur archaeologist, announced in 1880 that the painted images in the cave of Altamira on his estate were authentic prehistoric art, he was accused of forgery by leading academic prehistorians. The paintings were too sophisticated, too artistically accomplished to have been produced by Stone Age people. It was not until decades later, after similar paintings had been confirmed in other caves and after de Sautuola had died in disgrace, that the academic world admitted he had been correct. These episodes were not aberrations, they were patterns. The pattern of a discipline that again and again found it easier to deny inconvenient evidence than to expand the framework that made the evidence inconvenient. And the pattern, in milder and more politely expressed forms, has continued into the present. When ancient footprints at White Sands were dated to 23,000 years before the present, the response from much of the archaeological community was not curiosity but skepticism. with an immediate insistence on alternative explanations and the suggestion that the dating must be flawed. When Göbekli Tepe was first dated 12,000 years before the present, there were quiet rumours that the dating must be wrong, that the site must be intrusive, that something must have been miscalibrated because such a site simply could not exist at such a depth in time. When the platinum spike of the Younger Dryas impact horizon was first reported, the journals were filled with rebuttals, with calls for replication, with suggestions of contamination. The replication came. The contamination was ruled out. The platinum spike is real, and yet the impact hypothesis remains, in many corners of the academic discussion, treated as something one must distance oneself from, as a kind of professional liability. There is no need to invoke conspiracy to explain this pattern. The mechanism is more mundane and in some ways more troubling than any deliberate cover-up could be. It is the mechanism of professional incentive, of careers built upon particular interpretations, of textbooks already written, courses already taught, dissertations already defended. To accept that human history is older and stranger than the orthodox account allows would require, for many scholars, the painful acknowledgement that significant portions of their professional life had been spent in defence of an incomplete picture. Few people in any field are eager to make such an acknowledgement, and so the inertia continues. The marginal evidence accumulates, the unresolved questions grow more numerous, and the framework holds until, at some point, the weight of accumulated anomalies becomes too great to support, and a generational shift occurs in which younger scholars, less invested in the old paradigm, begin to ask new questions. Such shifts have happened before. They will happen again. The question is not whether they will happen. The question is what the shape of human history will look like on the other side of the next one, and whether the long-buried suspicion that something enormous took place at the threshold of the Holocene, something that the textbooks have, for 2 centuries, declined to examine in any detail, will finally be allowed to take its proper place in the recorded story of our species, or whether, as has happened so often before, the gatekeepers will simply hold the line for one more generation until those who knew the old certainties have all retired, and the question can at last be asked anew by someone who is not yet too tired to listen for the answer. While the gatekeepers have held their line, however, the answer has been speaking for itself in another voice altogether, a voice that belongs not to the academies but to the keepers of certain very old stories, stories so peculiar in their detail and so consistent across vast distances that they have long puzzled the anthropologist who collected them. For across cultures that had no possible contact with one another, separated by oceans and millennia, a particular kind of figure recurs in the foundational mythologies. The figure is always a stranger. He arrives almost always from across the sea or from out of the sky. He arrives almost always in the aftermath of some great disaster. He carries with him knowledge of agriculture, of architecture, of astronomy, of law, of medicine, and he teaches it to the survivors, who up until his arrival had been living in conditions of barbarism or destitution. He stays, sometimes for many years, sometimes for what is described as many lifetimes, and then, when his work is complete, he leaves. He sails away across the ocean, or he ascends back into the heavens, often promising to return at some future hour when his teachings will once again be needed. Among the Aztecs and the broader Mesoamerican peoples, this figure was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The accounts gathered by the Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, most extensively by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún in his Florentine Codex, describe him not as a god in the abstract sense, but as a person, or at least as a being who had walked among men. He had come, the tradition said, from the east across the sea. He had been pale-skinned and bearded, in striking contrast to the indigenous population. He had taught agriculture, the calendar, the working of metals, the building of cities. He had forbidden human sacrifice. He had stayed for a long time, governing wisely, before at last departing eastward across the same sea on a raft of woven serpents, with the promise that he would one day return. So strong was this expectation that when Hernan Cortes arrived in 1519 from the east, with pale skin and a beard, the Emperor Moctezuma is reported to have seriously considered whether the prophesied return had come. The mistake, of course, was disastrous. In the Andean traditions, the same figure recurs under a different name. Viracocha, the white-bearded teacher, rose from the waters of Lake Titicaca after a great cataclysm had destroyed the previous world. He walked across the mountains and the valleys, teaching the surviving peoples the arts of civilization, raising up the great stone walls and terraces whose remnants are still scattered across Peru and Bolivia. When his work was complete, he too departed across the sea, walking westward over the waves. The people he had taught built him no temples, in some accounts, because he had told them he couldn't be confined to a single place. He was for everyone. The pre-Inca site of Tiahuanaco, with its monumental stone gateways and its strange astronomical alignments, was attributed by the local traditions to Viracocha and his companions. The orthodox dating of Tiahuanaco places its construction within the last 2,000 years, but certain of its features, including the apparent water erosion patterns on some of its lower stonework and the peculiar astronomical alignments described by the Bolivian scholar Arthur Poznański in the early 20th century, have led some researchers to suspect a far older origin. Poznański's calculations, based on the celestial alignments of the Kalasasaya temple, returned a date of roughly 15,000 years before the present. His conclusions have been rejected by mainstream archaeology, but the alignments themselves are real and the question of how to date them remains, in some quarters, unresolved. In Mesopotamia, the figure appears as Oannes, described by Berossus in the fragments of his work that have come down to us through later quotations. Oannes was a being who emerged from the Persian Gulf, half-fish in form, who came ashore each day to teach the people of Sumer the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law, and who returned to the sea each evening. Other beings of similar kind, called the Apkallu in the Akkadian tradition, were said to have been sent to the early kings of Mesopotamia as advisors, bringing the foundational knowledge upon which all subsequent civilization rested. The Apkallu were depicted in palace reliefs as bearded men or composite creatures, often shown holding a curious bucket and pine cone whose meaning has never been satisfactorily explained. They were the bringers of the mess, the divine ordinances of civilization, which had existed before the kings and had been transmitted to humanity by these strange amphibian or semi-divine teachers. In Egypt, the parallel figure was Thoth, who, according to the priestly traditions, had walked the land in a remote prehistoric era and had taught the Egyptians writing, astronomy, geometry, music, and the rules of civilized life. The Greeks identified him with their own Hermes, and the later Hermetic traditions of late antiquity claimed to preserve the wisdom of this primordial teacher in a body of texts ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great. Whether the texts so ascribed actually preserve any genuine ancient material remains a matter of long scholarly dispute. But the underlying tradition that some figure or figures had brought civilization to Egypt from elsewhere, in a time before the historical pharaohs, was widely accepted in the ancient world and is still echoed in the strange chronologies of Manetho, who placed reigns of gods and demigods before his lists of mortal kings. In Polynesia, in West Africa, in parts of pre-contact North America, in the Indian subcontinent in China, similar figures recur. The Dogon people of Mali, famously, preserved traditions of beings called the Nommo, who had come from the sky and brought knowledge of certain astronomical phenomena that, according to the controversial reports of the anthropologist Marcel Griaule in the mid-20th century, included details about the star Sirius that should have been beyond the reach of any pre-telescopic observation. The accuracy and provenance of Griaule's reports have been heavily disputed, and the case remains contested. But the underlying story of teachers who came from elsewhere, brought knowledge and then withdrew, is preserved in the Dogon traditions as it is in so many others. What is one to make of this pattern? Skeptical scholars have long argued that it represents nothing more than a common feature of human imagination, a universal narrative tendency to attribute the origins of civilization to external benefactors rather than to one's own ancestors. The argument has merit. Human cultures do frequently mythologize their origins in this way, and yet the parallels are sometimes so specific. The bearded stranger, the post-cataclysmic timing, the eastward or westward departure across the sea, the promise of return. That one is permitted at least to wonder whether something more than imagination is at work. Whether what these traditions preserve in the form of myth is the dim recollection of an actual diaspora, of survivors from a lost cultural centre scattered after some catastrophe to the surviving populations of the world, carrying what fragments of their old knowledge they could remember, teaching what they could to those who would receive them, before settling at last into the pages of legend. If such survivors existed, they would have been few. Their knowledge would have been incomplete, fragmentary, badly transmissible across the language barriers and cultural divides they encountered. But what they did manage to transmit might have served as the seed for the strange suddenness of the Neolithic transition we considered earlier, for the agricultural emergence in widely scattered regions at very nearly the same time, for the unexplained precision of certain early monuments, for the curious astronomical alignments at sites whose builders, by orthodox accounts, should not yet have known how to align them. And one wonders sometimes whether the figure who walks through so many of the world's foundational myths, the bearded stranger from the sea, was not simply imagined, whether he existed in some form, whether he was real, and whether, when he sailed away with the promise that he would one day return, the promise was meant for us, for now, for the hour when the patterns of his departure might begin to look familiar again. Whether or not such a stranger ever sailed away from any vanished shore, the earth itself bears wounds from the hour of his alleged departure, wounds so vast that for most of recorded history they were not even recognized as wounds. They were too large to be seen as features of any particular landscape. They simply were the landscape. It took a peculiar kind of mind, willing to imagine catastrophes on a scale that ordinary geology resisted, to first read these scars for what they truly are. And the story of how that reading came to be accepted is itself one of the more remarkable episodes in the history of science. A small parable of how reality can hide in plain sight, until someone is finally willing to look at it without flinching. The case in point, and perhaps the most striking, lies in the inland Pacific Northwest of North America. Across a vast region of eastern Washington state, stretching from the foothills of the Rockies to the gorge of the Columbia River, the land bears a strange and disturbing aspect. Bare basalt outcrops rise from scoured ground. Enormous boulders, some weighing hundreds of tons and composed of rock alien to the local geology, sit isolated in the middle of fields where no glacier could plausibly have placed them. Channels too large to be rivers, hundreds of meters wide and tens of meters deep, run dry through the bedrock, stripped clean of soil. Coulees, dry waterfalls, plunge pools the size of city blocks, features whose only obvious explanation would be the action of catastrophic flooding on a scale that no orthodox geologist of the early 20th century was willing to accept. The region was called the Channeled Scablands, and in 1923 a young geologist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed an explanation for it that took the academic community 4 decades to accept. Bretz argued that the scablands had been carved by a sudden flood of almost unimaginable proportions, not by gradual erosion, not by ordinary glacial meltwater, but by a single or possibly several catastrophic releases of water on a scale that would have made the Mississippi look like a creek. The volume of water he proposed, the velocities he calculated, the sheer scope of the event he described, all of it was so far beyond what the gradualist orthodoxy of geology was prepared to entertain that he was met with ridicule for many years. The phrase outrageous hypothesis was used in the technical literature to describe his proposal. Geological societies organized expeditions specifically to refute him. He was almost denied tenure. The reasons for his eventual vindication came slowly, as the source of his proposed flood was identified, a giant ice-dammed lake called Lake Missoula, which had repeatedly formed behind the lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet that blocked the Clark Fork River in Montana. When the ice dam failed, as it apparently did dozens of times over the millennia, the entire lake, some 2,000 cubic kilometers of water, comparable in volume to half of modern Lake Michigan, drained across the landscape in a matter of days, gouging the scablands into their present form. By the 1970s, Bretz's outrageous hypothesis had become the accepted account. He lived to see his vindication, dying in 1981 at the age of 98, a few years after receiving the highest honor in his profession. The lesson of Bretz's vindication is not merely that he was right. It is that the orthodoxy of geology had been, for decades, unable to even imagine a catastrophe of the scale he was describing. The principle of uniformitarianism, that the present is the key to the past, that geological processes occur at rates we can observe today, that the Earth is shaped by gradual change rather than sudden upheaval, had been so deeply ingrained in the discipline since the time of Charles Lyell in the early 19th century that any proposal of catastrophic mechanisms was treated as a kind of intellectual heresy. The scablands had been hiding in plain sight, walked over by countless travellers, mapped by official surveys photographed from the air, and yet the question of what had carved them had simply not been asked, because the answer was unthinkable. It took a particular willingness on Bretz's part to entertain the unthinkable, to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of whether the destination was acceptable to the discipline. And the scablands, dramatic as they are, may not be the only such scar. Along the Atlantic coast of the United States, from Delaware down through the Carolinas and into Florida and Georgia, the land bears a peculiar feature that has puzzled investigators since it was first recognized from aerial photography in the 1930s. Across this region are scattered hundreds of thousands of shallow elliptical depressions in the ground, oriented along a remarkably consistent axis, varying in size from small ponds to features more than a kilometer in length. They are called the Carolina Bays. Their origin has been the subject of debate for nearly a century. Various explanations have been proposed: that they are old beds of forgotten lakes, that they are the work of unusual wind patterns acting on sandy substrates, that they are the scars of meteor showers, that they are the result of bursting subsurface gas pockets. None of the proposed explanations has fully satisfied. The depressions are too consistent in their orientation to be wind-blown. They lack the rim structures one would expect from impact craters in the conventional sense, and yet they are unmistakably aligned, as if some single great event had impressed itself upon the landscape from a single direction. In recent decades, certain researchers, particularly those associated with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis we've already considered, have proposed that the Carolina Bays may be the secondary impact features produced by ejecta from a major airburst or impact event over the Laurentide ice sheet. The idea, briefly, is that a massive cosmic impact upon the ice would have hurled enormous quantities of frozen and rocky material into ballistic trajectories, which on returning to Earth would have struck the relatively soft sediments of the Atlantic coastal plain at high velocities, producing the elliptical depressions we now see. The orientation of the bays, when their axes are extrapolated, points back toward the region of the Great Lakes, exactly the region where, by independent evidence, an airburst over the Laurentide ice may have occurred. The hypothesis is not accepted by the geological mainstream, which continues to favour wind and water explanations, but the alignment of the bays is real, and the question of what could have produced it remains, by any honest accounting, unresolved. There are other geological features that bear discussing in the same breath. The vast erratic boulders scattered across the upper Midwest, some of them composed of rock from origins hundreds of kilometers distant. The deeply scoured surfaces of certain bedrock exposures in regions where ordinary glacial action seems insufficient to account for the evidence. The strange anomalies in the lowest deposits across China and Central Asia, the drowned forest floors found beneath North Sea sediments. None of these is, in isolation, proof of any particular hypothesis, but each of them is a question. Each of them is a place where the Earth seems to remember something that the textbooks have not yet quite acknowledged, and taken together, they form a picture of a planet whose surface has been more violently rearranged in recent geological time than the orderly diagrams of the discipline tend to suggest. It is a strange thing to walk across such terrain. The fields of eastern Washington, the swampy bays of the Carolinas, the boulder-strewn plains of the upper Midwest. To ordinary eyes, they are simply scenery. To eyes that have learned to read them, they are pages. Pages from a book the planet has been keeping all along, written in the only language available to a planet, the slow language of stone and sediment and water, recording the events that no human voice survived to describe. And one walks across such pages with a particular humility, knowing that the ground beneath one's feet is not perhaps the quiet, stable foundation it pretends to be, knowing that it has been broken before, knowing that the breaking on the scale at which the Earth measures such things was very recent indeed. The recency, when one finally allows oneself to feel it, is the part that disturbs the longest. For if the great breaking of the world was as close to us in time as the evidence suggests, if it occurred not in some unimaginably distant geological era, but only 12 or 13,000 years ago, in the same span of years that separates us from the building of Göbekli Tepe, then the question begins to slide from the past tense into the present. The question is no longer simply, what happened? The question becomes whether what happened is the kind of thing that happens, and whether the silence between such happenings is the silence of safety or merely the silence of waiting. Among the more disquieting strands of modern astronomy is the study of what is called the Taurid meteor stream. The Earth passes through this stream of cometary debris twice each year, in late June and again in late October and early November, when the night sky displays the familiar Taurid meteor showers. The stream itself is the residue, scientists believe, of a single very large comet that broke apart sometime in the relatively recent astronomical past, possibly within the last 20 or 30,000 years. Its largest surviving fragment is the periodic comet known as Encke, which orbits the Sun every 3 1/3 years. But within the broader stream lie many other fragments, some of them quite substantial, on orbits that periodically intersect with the Earth's. The astronomers Victor Klube and Bill Napier, working at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh during the 1980s and 1990s, made a sustained argument that the torrid stream represents an ongoing impact hazard of greater concern than the broader astronomical community had been willing to admit. They proposed that the periodic intensifications of the stream, when the Earth passes through particularly dense regions of debris, could account for clusters of impacts and airbursts in the historical record, and could plausibly account also for the catastrophe at the close of the Pleistocene. Klube and Napier's hypothesis has not become the consensus, but it has not been refuted either. It hangs, like so much else we have considered, in the strange unresolved space where serious science waits for additional evidence to tip it one way or another. What is not in dispute is that the Earth does periodically encounter cometary debris of varying sizes, that such encounters can produce airbursts capable of devastating large regions. The Tunguska event of 1908, in which an airburst over Siberia flattened more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest, is the most familiar modern example, and that the sky is not, despite the comforting steadiness with which it appears to behave during any human lifetime, a uniformly safe place. The intervals between major impacts may be long by human reckoning. They are not long by the reckoning of the Earth. The civilization in which we now live is the first in human history to have developed, even in principle, the technical means to detect and potentially deflect an incoming bolide. Programs such as NASA's planetary defense initiatives and the International Space Guard surveys that catalogue near-Earth objects represent humanity's first serious attempt to look upward with the intention of warning ourselves. These programs are recent, they're underfunded, they have, by the admission of those who run them, catalogued only a fraction of the objects in our local neighbourhood that could conceivably pose a threat. The smaller objects, the kind that produce regional rather than global catastrophes, the kind that arrive without much warning, the kind that may have been involved in the close of the Pleistocene, are particularly difficult to track. We do not, in any complete sense, know what is out there. We are looking, but we've just begun. And so the long question reaches forward across the threshold of the present moment and out into the unwritten future. The vanished world of 12,000 years ago may not have been the last vanished world. It may merely have been the most recent. The civilization, or proto-civilization, or scattering of unrecorded peoples whose memory survives in the flood myths and the buried temples and the strange processional alignments. They may have been victims of a kind of event that the universe produces with some regularity, and that our own civilization, despite all its powers, has done very little to prepare for. The voices of those vanished peoples speak now only through stone and silt and stories. But what they have to say, if one listens carefully, is not merely a record, it is a warning. The warning, perhaps, that what once happened can happen again. The warning that what we now call history is only the surface of a much deeper sequence of beginnings and endings. The warning that the comfortable conviction of our own permanence may be the same conviction held by every previous people whose names we no longer know. There is something to be said, however, for sitting quietly with such a thought rather than fleeing from it. The ancients, by every indication, sat with it more often than we do. The cyclical cosmologies of Hindu and Mesoamerican thought, in which great ages give way to one another through cataclysms before beginning anew, were not pessimistic doctrines, but realistic ones. They acknowledged that the world had been broken before and would be broken again, and that wisdom consisted in part of remembering this. The orthodoxies of recent centuries, with their faith in linear progress and their tendency to read the past as a story of upward development, have made it difficult for the modern mind to entertain such cyclical thinking without feeling somehow superstitious. But the geological evidence, when one allows it to speak, sounds a great deal more like the ancient cosmologies than like the textbook timelines. The Earth has been through this before. So, almost certainly has humanity. What remains is the question of what one does with such knowledge. There is no clear answer. The catastrophe, if it comes, may not come in any of our lifetimes, or in any of the lifetimes of our grandchildren. It may not come for thousands of years. It may not come at all. The Taurids may pass quietly. The asteroids may stay in their orbits. The ice may melt slowly rather than suddenly, and the consequences may unfold across timescales that allow adaptation rather than rupture. Or the sky may break open tomorrow afternoon. The honest position is that we do not know. The honest position is that we've inherited a planet whose history is older and stranger and more violent than the schoolbooks ever taught us, and that the future, like the past, is more open than we have been encouraged to believe. Perhaps that is the message that someone 12,000 years ago was trying to leave us. Not in any single language, not in any single monument, but scattered across the surface of the earth in a kind of dispersed testimony, fragments here and fragments there, a vulture carved on a buried pillar, a processional alignment built into a sphinx that faces the dawn, a scoured channel in eastern Washington, an Aboriginal song that names a coastline now beneath the sea. Read individually, the fragments are puzzles. Read together, they form something close to a letter from the survivors of a vanished world, addressed to whoever, in some distant century, might at last be ready to recognize what they had lived through. A letter that says, in the only words available to people whose words have all been lost, we were here, we saw something terrible, we tried to remember, and we hoped that you, whoever you turn out to be, would have the courage to remember it with us. The candle of any given civilization burns for a while in the long darkness, and then it goes out, and the darkness moves in to take back what it had only briefly lent. We are the latest in a long line of those who have lit such candles. Whether ours burns longer than theirs or shorter is not yet decided. But the wax is shorter than we tend to assume. The night is wider, and the wind somewhere beyond the edge of what we can see is always moving,